Amen. Well, today we do have the sacred privilege, once again, of partaking in Holy Communion with one another. It's always a pleasure to do this, and yet today is extra special because we get to do so in the knowledge that thousands of other congregations together with us are celebrating World Communion Sunday. And we always know, when we share in Holy Communion, that millions of other Christians across the planet are doing the same, just as we always know that millions of Christians are worshiping God in Christ, singing praises to them and praying to them as we are each Sunday morning. This is something that makes worshiping together such an amazing experience. And yet it's something that we often forget about in our focus on the daily needs and doings of our congregation. And we know, after all, that ministry and missions work have to operate in context, and that we have to begin within the context and place of our own community before spreading that gospel beyond and stretching our missions work elsewhere. Yet some of the most memorable moments and some of my best worship experiences have come on those special occasions and in those special times and places when I have felt undeniably linked with the rest of the Christian world, the worldwide church. Do you ever travel away from home or attend church in another place? I know many of our snowbirds do this every year. You ever do that and find yourself wondering what your home congregation is doing on that Sunday morning? Or, of course, you have an idea what they're doing. You know that they are worshiping just as you are. But it's comforting to think about that when you are in another place, is it not? It's reassuring to remember that Christians are worshiping, singing, and praying together in all corners of the globe, including our hometowns and local communities. This is something that I've been able to experience in many places and at various times. And in fact, one of the most profound examples of this for me occurs on the night of Christmas Eve. Having spent my entire life celebrating Christmas and attending the Christmas Eve service in my own hometown due to the fact that Dad was always working that night, the last few years have been kind of surreal, but also very special on that night. As I've spent Christmas Eve in a few different locations for the first time the last few years, including our first year in our new hometown in Walled Lake. And though spending Christmas away from home, that is, away from the home in which one grew up, it can be difficult. It has in some ways made Christmas Eve and Christmas Day more significant, perhaps more magical for what they are. Because we know in the back of our minds that everyone is celebrating all over, wherever we are and wherever we have been, at home and abroad. This kind of communion is what makes the Christian church, and to a lesser extent the United Methodist Church, so powerful and so pervasive. We are all sharing in that same spiritual experience together. So today we're taking a look at the meaning of communion. And we're going to take a look at that meaning beyond the simple ritual of eating bread and drinking from the cup. For starters, for example, if I was to ask, what does communion mean to each of you? I would probably get many different answers. Some would say that it is about sharing in a holy and blessed meal with those others present. Some would say that it is about welcoming others and ourselves continuously into the presence of Christ. Still more would probably say that it is about the symbolism of the bread and the wine, that it is about the body and blood of Christ and the sacrifice that he made for each of us and all of us. And we talked about that last month when we talked about the symbolism of the cup, didn't we? And all of those answers would be right. And all of them would be based on the actual ritual in which we partake together. But just for kicks today, what about the real meaning of that term? What does it mean beyond that? Where did that come from? It didn't originate only with the Christian ritual of the bread and wine, after all. So taking a moment, the actual word communion, for us word nerds out there may be a few of us, including me. So the term that we use primarily here in our church, we could also say Eucharist if we wanted to, but that would be a different context. It originally comes from the Latin communis, meaning common or general, and it's a combination of the roots com, meaning with or together, and unis, meaning union or oneness. So we are all being one together through this term. And this, of course, is where we get words like commune or community. This is the root of that. And in Latin, you also have the nominative communio, meaning fellowship, mutual participation, or sharing of something. So, while these terms and this term have ultimately become synonymous with the sharing of the bread and cup through the Christian ritual, they certainly have not been and are not only used in this way. We also use the term communion to describe being in communion with one another. That can take many forms. What other images might it bring to mind for you? In what other ways do we find ourselves in communion? One thing that comes to my mind, something that pops up when I read the modern definition. As of this morning, the word communion, and I'm going to reveal my age here, it has 3 definitions listed on Google. I didn't look up anything in Webster, I looked it up on Google. One such definition reads, the service of Christian worship at which bread and wine are consecrated and shared. The idea of consecration is one we haven't talked about very much. We might get into that later, but this is pretty much the first thing we all think of, right? This definition. There is a second religious definition that I'm going to share in a moment. But the third definition is a more general one. And it reads thus: it is the sharing or exchanging of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially when the exchange is on a mental or spiritual level. So, and the term, of course, functions as a noun in all 3 of these definitions. But that third one, it's not quite what you would expect, is it? The sharing or exchanging of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially on a spiritual or mental level. What does that bring forth for you? The example that I keep thinking of is the experience of sitting around a campfire together. Maybe on a trip with a group of friends or family, roasting marshmallows, telling stories. It could also be something like a church camp gathering, spiritually based, built around worship or singing. The fire bowl, right? Or, since we've already mentioned it, it could mean gathering together with loved ones around Christmas or Thanksgiving. These, to me, are all times of great communion. And there's usually good food involved, too. But what about the things we are doing this morning, other than partaking in communion? We've taken a couple minutes here to sort of remind ourselves of all the meanings that this word can have. So how about we finish by revisiting what communion already is? For it is that ritual of communion, it is the sacrifice of Christ that makes all these other types of communion possible. That is why we celebrate through this holy act with the worldwide church. So that final Google definition is probably the best one, probably my favorite, and it's also a sort of religious definition. It reads, a relationship of recognition and acceptance between Christian churches or denominations, or between individual Christians or Christian communities and a church. And it's signified by a willingness to give or receive the Eucharist. To me, World Communion Sunday is all about that final definition. Today we gather together in the presence of God to sing and be glad with millions of others around the globe. We gather as Psalm 133 wishes us to gather. It's one of my favorite short and sweet psalms. We used it, in fact, for a call to worship earlier this summer. Maybe you remember it. How good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down upon the collar of his robes. It is as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion, for there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. That one's a little different from most of the other psalms. It's a little shorter, a little simpler. There's something about the imagery in that passage, though, that I really love, and I love its focus on the joy of being together in godly unity. So, with our last couple minutes, I'll share one other of my favorites today. It's the one I mentioned earlier. One of our hymns, it's 632 if you're interested in looking it up. Draw Us in the Spirit's Tether. We tried singing this last year on World Communion Sunday. It didn't go too well. It's got kind of a tricky meter. It's kind of a tricky 6/4. But there is a nice arrangement of it on YouTube that I'll post with this week's sermon if you'd like to listen. The tune's lovely, and so especially are the lyrics. There's 3 verses. Draw us in the Spirit's tether, for when humbly in thy name 2 or 3 are met together, thou art in the midst of them. Touch we now thy garment's hem. As disciples used to gather in the name of Christ to sup, then with thanks to God the Father, break the bread and bless the cup. So now bind our friendship up. All our meals and all our living make as sacraments of thee, that by caring, helping, giving, we may true disciples be. We will serve thee faithfully. And there's a couple of alleluias in there as well. We can get so much out of our psalms and our hymns just by revisiting those words and lyrics now and then. They can be beautiful and full of life. So we have a lot of meanings for this term, communion, a lot of meanings beyond the bread and the cup. But that's still the main one, isn't it? So this week's sermon, it doesn't really have a profound point beyond what has been said already. It's all pretty simple and straightforward, which oftentimes is probably the way it should be. We could revisit our gospel reading today. It told us the story of the Last Supper. We could summarize it again for you, but you all know it pretty well. We could spend a few minutes exploring our sacred duty as Christians to be kind and caring to our neighbors, especially as our brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico, fellow citizens of the United States, are suffering in the aftermath of yet another deadly and terrifying storm. Surely we need to remain in communion with these other children of God and provide them help where we can. But we have spent lots of time focusing on this the last few weeks, and for good reason. But with that in mind for today, let us also give thanks that in the world of Christ and in the creation of God, there are indeed many easy truths and simple pleasures. So today, all we really need to remember is this: that it's good to be together. And it is a blessing to share in communion here and throughout the world. Thanks be to God, and amen.